This one. Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. The fundamental principles that we articulate each day are as follows in order to make sense of the chaos. First, God created the cosmos for His glory, not for the glory of man. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God, as the sovereign creator of all that is, ordained Adam's fall. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell, including all of mankind and all of the physical cosmos. Five, as a result of the fall, God pronounced the curse of enmity between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, who at this point is we get the first glimmerings of His coming as the promised Messiah. And all those in Him, they will be at enmity with the seed of the serpent. The serpent, of course, is Satan, fallen Adam, all the demons, and all of humanity that remains in fallen Adam remains fallen, remains in rebellion against God until their deaths. This is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, all subsequent human experience, social experience, all interactions between human beings, all of history that is an outworking of this great antithesis. Seventh, the unregenerate, those who remain rebels against God, or without excuse, God has clearly revealed Himself in the cosmos and in them. They know He exists and they suppress that truth in unrighteousness. They are guilty of culpable self-deceit. And eighth, the word of the cross is foolishness, moronic, to those who are perishing. The world's going to see you as a Dumbo if you're preaching the gospel. And so you need to understand that you're going to constantly feel an urge to soften some of the extreme aspects of the gospel because they seem so foolish to the world. Well, that's where the rubber's going to meet the road for you and for me and every other Christian. And in the end, we will be judged good and faithful servants based upon how we answer this challenge. Jesus says that if you deny Him before men, if you soften the gospel, if you wish to present yourself and the gospel as smart, intellectual, acceptable to unbelievers, then you're denying Jesus. Okay. The gospel is never going to be acceptable to unbelievers. It will be presented to them, and God will use that gospel to pierce the hearts of His elect among the unregenerate and to change their hearts, to grant them new hearts, new eyes, new ears, and a new understanding. And you have to let Him do that. You have to be willing to be the moron for Christ. Otherwise, you're just being a fool. Okay, so we're talking about church and state, and specifically how the church and state should relate. What did John Calvin think about that? Why is that important? Well, because he was the first one to enunciate clear principles of how the church is supposed to relate to the state and how the state is supposed to relate to the church. In fact, he did more than that. He taught that God established for all men 4 forms of government to control their behavior. I mean, unless people are naturally good, which we know is not true, then there has to be some way to control their behavior. Is it just the government? I mean, are we just supposed to be little robots and puppets and the government tells us what to do and regulates our behavior? Because I assure you, that's what the progressives want to do. That's what they started doing in the 1930s. There were no regulatory agencies of any significant import before the 30s. There was the Railroad Commission, but other than that, I'm really not aware of any regulatory agencies. And you know, we've grown so accustomed to the idea of the government regulating the behavior of citizens, the behavior of businesses, that we think, well, it's perfectly all right. But really, the government regulating how you live your life, regulating it, we're not talking about God's law, which doesn't regulate how you live your life. What it does is it tells you how to live your life, and then it gives you the freedom within certain parameters to go out and do what you want. And unless you violate one of the thou shalt nots, then God leaves you alone, lets you do what you want. But when the government gets involved in regulating your life, it doesn't just say thou shalt not, it says also thou shalt. Now, God's laws can be summarized in 2 sentences. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second sentence is love your neighbor as yourself. 2 sentences. Now, the regulations for any one of the regulatory agencies of the federal government would probably take up more space than there is in this room. One of those. And how many are there? There are dozens of regulatory agencies regulating your behavior and mine, telling you that you can't tear off a tag on a mattress, for instance. Wanting to control every detail of your life. But you see, when we deny God, if we're going to have any certitude in our lives, if we are going to feel safe in our lives, then we need to try to control every possible contingency. Can't have something popping up over here or popping up over there over which we have no control. And so the urge to be over regulatory is always there for people. What's the answer to that? Well, the answer is what Calvin said. The 4 forms of government that he recognized, that God, he says, set out for men. First of all, self-government. You, as an independent human being, you have the obligation to govern yourself. By what standard? Well, obviously, by the standard given us in the Bible. What if you fail to do so? Well, at that point, then, you become subject to correction by the other 3 forms of government. What are they? Family government, church government, and finally, civil government. Well, how is that supposed to work? Well, let's say we have the church. Now, the church is responsible to govern certain things. What are those things? Well, it governs worship. It also ministers to the poor. It delivers the gospel. It is responsible for upholding and maintaining all morality. And so it's the church that's going to teach the individual how to live his life according to God's laws, because the church, that's its role. The church also is going to teach the family how to regulate the life of the family. And the church will also teach the civil government how to govern morally according to God's laws. What is the family government supposed to do? Well, the family government, the father is supposed to govern the family. But before he governs the family, he has to govern himself. And then he's subject to the government of the church when he exceeds what God says, or he violates what God says, are the strictures of his obligations to govern the family. For instance, does a father have, because he's governing his family under the Bible, does he have the authority, the right to starve his children? Well, obviously not. Does he have a right to discipline his children, including corporal punishment? Yes, he does. How much corporal punishment? Is he allowed to cut off their leg? Well, no. So the church government exercises authority over the family government when the governing authority in the family, the head of the family, the father, violates his authority within the family. Additionally, the civil government has authority over the family as well. If the father decides he wants to kill his child and murders the child, then the civil government steps in, not only the church government, but the civil government steps in and says this is a violation of a criminal statute that God has placed them in charge of. They're the magistrate and they wield the sword. They do not wield the sword in vain, Paul says. And so as they're wielding the sword against the head of the family because of his violation of a criminal law, which is under their purview, then we see how all these forms of government work at the same time. And you have to have all four forms of government for society to run smoothly, and they must all be under God's authority, and they must all recognize the authority of the other forms of government, and they must limit their use of authority to their own sphere. But just taking a peremptory look at that, where do you think the likelihood for most abuse is going to come from? Is it going to come from the individual? No. Is it going to come from the family? No. How about the church? Well, this could come a lot from there, yeah. But isn't the likelihood for the greatest abuse where the greatest power is going to reside? Now, obviously, the power of the sword in terms of temporal power is the greatest power that's going to be exercised by any of those four governmental divisions. The individual is not allowed to use the sword to impose his will on other people. Now, he's allowed to use the sword to defend himself, or a gun in the case of today, but the sword is a symbol. He's not allowed to use killing power except to defend himself or another person who's in danger of great bodily harm or death. That's God's law. But the civil government is given broad authority to use the sword to defend God's criminal laws against those who would break those laws. Now, Calvin believed and taught that no society can function properly and harmoniously under God, continuing to preserve itself indefinitely unless all four governmental forms are subject to the authority of God. Think about it. If the state is making up rules of law out of thin air, how can it be in a proper relationship with the other forms of government? If the state tells me that I must agree that a man who claims that he is a woman is then a woman, and I must treat him as a woman, and I must be willing to marry him even, well, I have to resist that. I can't go along with that because the state has no authority to do anything beyond what God says it can do. Now, we're not used to thinking in those terms, but unless we think in those terms, and specifically as Christians, unless we think in those terms, what we're doing is we're handing over God's rod of authority to unbelievers, rebels against God, who are going to use that authority, first of all, against Christians. Against Christians, first of all. You have to understand that. Our hope, our defense, our bulwark, our fortress is not the government. It's not the president. It's not the U.S. Supreme Court. It's Jesus Christ. It's the Word of God. But we have to defend that Word of God. We have to say the Word of God applies to everybody in every area of life, in every circumstance, all the time. Because if we don't believe that, and we don't apply that in our own lives, then we can never expect anybody else to believe that, and we can never expect to have any peace in this world. We will have constant conflict. We will have the individual pitted against all three of the other forms of authority. We will have the family pitted against all three of the other forms of authority. We will have the church pitted against all three of the other forms of authority. And we'll have the state pitted against all three of the other forms of authority. Does that sound like a harmonious society to you? Is that a society in which you want to live? That's where we're going. Why? Why are we going in that direction? Because the church has failed in its obligation to God to be faithful to preach the word in season and out, faithfully, willing to be viewed as morons for Christ. We don't want that. We want to be, well, we want to be winsome. We want them, we don't want to end up offend them, and we can't be going there. We don't want to tell them there's absolute truth, and the absolute truth is binding on each of those forms of government as well. We don't want to be telling other families, oh, God has absolutely said this is how your family should be run, because that sounds too absolutist, right? Well, it is, but God's an absolute God, and truth is absolute or it's absent. There are only two choices: either there is no truth, or truth is absolutely true. There's no truth for you and a truth for me that butt heads somewhere. That is not possible. You may have your opinion, I may have my opinion, and those may butt heads. But truth itself, no. Never. That is not possible. Our understanding of truth, our opinions of what the truth says, yes. But if there is a truth, then there's an ultimate standard by which it's to be judged. When we sit down to argue about anything, we can only do that if we both agree that there's an ultimate standard to be appealed to. And if I am properly understanding the ultimate standard and I convince you of it, then I'll change your mind. And if you understand it properly and I don't, and you present it properly to me, you'll change my mind. We have to assume that when we're in an argument. That's the whole foundation of an argument. Not just yelling back and forth, that kind of argument. But I'm talking about in the sense that lawyers argue back and forth before a judge, making your case. Anyway, each of the four must cooperate with the others in governing the unruly hearts of men. Moreover, all four forms of government have their own areas of responsibility, although there is often a great deal of overlap between them. Because all authority is God's authority, and because he grants specific authority to the four governmental forms, Calvin taught that under no circumstance should they assume antagonistic attitudes toward one another. Well, of course. You can't have the church fighting against the state and the state fighting against the church, the family fighting against the state and the church, the individual fighting against all three of the others. You can't have that. There's no possible harmony. Nor is one form of government intended by God to assume dominance over any of the other three. But we assume that today. We assume that the state, the civil government, the federal government in our country has ultimate authority over every issue. That's the general assumption. It's false. It has authority that's strictly limited by God. And when it exceeds those limits, it is erring. It's wrong. It's sinning. And it may be even committing crimes. And we need to hold the civil government accountable when it is doing things it has no authority to do. And we can't be considering the price to us. The price to us, if we fail to do that, is far more heinous, far greater. Do you want your children and your grandchildren living in bondage under tyrannous governments? Because if you don't stand for freedom today, if you're willing to accept bondage today, then you're consigning your descendants to that same fate. Is that what you want? You have to stand up and fight. God is sovereign. God has all power. God laughs in derision. Psalm 2, remember yesterday? He laughs in derision against the rulers that would presume to rebel against his law, against his truth. There is no other law. There is no other truth. People who say, well, law is what people make of it. No, that's not possible. That's not possible. People cannot make unright right. That's not possible. Law, in order to be law, must reflect the equity expressed by God in his word somewhere. If it's not equitable, it cannot be law. It can be binding on you. It can be a tyrannous demand, an edict, a fiat word from the governing authority. That certainly is possible. You know, as Mao Zedong said, that all argument ends at the mouth of the gun. Well, yes, and for him, that was the ultimate right and wrong. If you have the gun and he doesn't have the gun, you're right and he's wrong. That's what he said. And that's the assumption of all progressives, that ultimately, if they have the power, they can tell you what's right and they can demand that you follow what they say, whether it comports with God's law or not. And they will. And they will. Believe me, they will. Okay? There has to be a standard of right and wrong that everybody follows. And if the standard is my will or the will of my group and not God, it will be a false standard. It will be arbitrary, and it will be tyrannous. Nor is one form of government intended by God to assume dominance over any of the other three. Rather, they are intended by God to cooperate with and support one another. There is, therefore, a sense in which they are to be regarded as separate and distinct, although interrelated and mutually dependent, but each having full authority within its own sphere. As long as the father is running the family and not violating God's law, the church has nothing to say to him about it, and the civil government has nothing to say, has no authority to say anything to him. No authority. Authority is not the same thing as raw power. If I have a gun, I have raw power. But that gun does not give me authority. God alone. Jesus Christ said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Well, if he has all authority, do you think that that authority can be wrested from his hand at the point of a gun? I don't think so. I don't think he's afraid of a gun. And I don't think that the man who holds a gun, because he holds the gun, also has authority by virtue of that gun. He has authority by virtue of God having granted it to him through Jesus Christ. No other way. No other way. Okay? And any claim to have any authority that is not buttressed by God's authority is false. It is false. And it will be tyrannical. It will be tyrannical. You may be certain of that. Because men are fallen. They cannot be trusted with authority in their hands alone. They cannot. Not me, not you, not anybody. The two forms we will be dealing with as we examine the question of authority is church government and civil government. Over the course of the last 2 centuries, secularism, that's the idea that there's the secular and the sacred, and government is popularly regarded as devoted to the secular view, not the sacred, not religious. There's a radical distinction between these two, a divorce of the secular from the sacred. And so the secular is what men think apart from what God has to say. Well, over the last 2 centuries, that idea has eroded the original conception of the separation of church and state enunciated by Calvin and later echoed in the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution, you may be surprised to discover, it was largely influenced by Calvinism. The idea of the separation of powers, of the 3 divisions of power, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. That's right out of John Calvin. The assumption that men cannot be trusted with power, right out of John Calvin. Most of the fathers of our country were either Calvinists or they were strongly influenced by Calvinist thinking. In fact, the Revolutionary War was known in England, one of the nicknames for it, it was called the Presbyterian Rebellion. Why Presbyterian? Well, because Presbyterianism is, well, at least traditionally at that time, was the embodiment of Calvinism. Today, well, no. The Presbyterian Church USA, PCUSA, is hardly Calvinistic at all. It's mostly secular, actually, if you want to know. Today, it is generally accepted as proper across the spectrum of the population, including both Christians and non-Christians, to radically bifurcate our lives between the political and the religious, the secular and the sacred. This is a sharp departure from Calvin's and the Bible's concept of separation of church and state. It tacitly assumes either a deistic God who created the world, set it in motion, and then withdrew, or a completely naturalistic world without a creator, where religion is no more than a vestige of superstitious practice. I mean, think about it. If we think that we can run the government without reference to what God has to say, then what we've at least tacitly done, maybe we didn't say this is what we're doing, but this is at least what we're implicitly doing, is we're taking God and we're putting him over on a shelf over there. You know, kind of like the fellow that had come, the book salesman had come to my office years ago, and I had just become a Christian maybe a year or two earlier. And so I spent the time, probably a whole hour, talking to him about Jesus and about Christianity. At the end of that time, he wanted to make the book sale, so he was patient, and he sat there while I talked. And then when I finished, he said, well, you know, my wife and I we've been talking about getting a little church in our lives. and I thought, well, in my mind's eye, I could see on his mantle a little church, but not too big. Not too big. We don't want it to interfere with how he's going to live, but he needed a little church in his life. Well, that's how we're doing in our country when we regard the civil government as secular, as not related to what God has to say. We think we can have a little God in our lives, and we'll put him up on the mantle, and every now and then we may even genuflect to him, as long as we don't have to obey him. You don't want to have to obey him. Listen, when you die, you will discover there was nothing about your life that God wasn't intimately concerned about and in control of and had an opinion about, good or bad. Nothing. And certainly not the government of the country within which you lived. Oh no. Anyway, from a practical standpoint, treating God as a deistic God who set the world in motion and then just kind of hands off, oh, look at that, look what they're doing. Or seeing Christianity as just a vestige of superstitious practice. Either way, they both minimalize and marginalize Christianity. And as Christians, you can't possibly accept that. I mean, unless you want to put your Jesus up on the mantle as well. Don't put him in your heart. Don't let him rule your heart. No, put him on the mantle. And people come in, you say, there's my Jesus. Or you could have a picture on the wall, like Catholics like to do. There's my Jesus, or a crucifix. See, for Catholics, they want their Jesus on a crucifix. They don't want him down off the wall because they don't want to deal with the demands of Christ in our lives each day. Radically divorcing the secular from the sacred also requires believers to assume neutrality between believers and God deniers in the political arena. To the degree that believers acquiesce in the notion that amoral political governance is possible, they not only falsely assume neutrality, they assist unbelievers in jettisoning God and his principles of equity from the public square. Then, having done so, they are astonished to find a moral jungle springing to life around them with choking vines of cultural sin ensnaring them from every direction. Isn't that what we find? Well, here's the punchline. There is no neutrality. It is a lie from the devil. There is no neutrality in the world. There's no moral neutrality. There's no spiritual neutrality. There is no brute fact existing in the world that doesn't testify either that there is no God or that the Creator God exists. Everybody sees every fact of creation with either the glasses of no God or God. There is no area in between that says, well, there may be a God, there may not be a God. No. If you say there may not be a God, then you're seeing the world as if there is no God. There's no in-between. Claiming there's an in-between is just smoke and mirrors. You're fooling yourself. You're not even doing that very well, but you're surely not fooling God, nor are you fooling anyone who thinks seriously about these questions. At any rate, I see that our 30 minutes is up, and I'm sorry because I'm having such a good time. I love talking about God and about Christianity and how it impacts our lives at every point. Every point. Bill, do you have anything you'd like to add? Well, then I hope to see you tomorrow, but tomorrow will be 7:30, not 7, because I'm having breakfast with my good friend Earl. My brother is going to be, I think, in Atlanta. I think he's going to investigate what happened with that shooting. I'm joking. That's a whole nother issue, isn't it? Which I'm not going to get into. Not today for sure. It's too late. At any rate, remember this, okay? This is the day that God has made, and he has made you and put you in it, and you owe him the duty of service to him all day long, 24 hours. So let's be about that, and let's remember there are worse things than dying, and the very worst thing of all is to be unfaithful to God. God bless you. Have a great day.